Hello there, and welcome to the Part24 podcast. It's another Monday. Had a great weekend with the kid. We took her to a picnic in Bun Hill Cemetery on Saturday, where Bayes, the inventor of Bayesian statistics, is buried. Beautiful green, grassy area, and ran in the sprinklers, and just generally had a lovely time. And then yesterday, took the kids swimming and went to the zoo. Again, just a perfect sunny British weekend. Couldn't have asked for anything better. And started the week with something of a bang. On Friday night, I was down in Leicester Square to see a movie, and at one of the cinemas at the big Odeon, they were having some kind of premiere. And there was a man out front with a megaphone shouting at everyone that they would have to be prepared to surrender their mobile phones, put them in a bag, and leave them behind the counter for the duration of the movie, which the more I thought about it, the weirder it was, because of course, your mobile phone isn't just a phone, although it is that too. It's also often used as a cash replacement. There's a lot of payment processing you can do with your phone. It has a lot of confidential information on it, scheduling. It can be an authentication token to get into your network. It may be emitting positional data. It has your confidential contacts and so on. And of course, it's increasingly indispensable, asking people to leave their mobile phone at home. For some people, depending on what uses they're putting their phone to, is just not on. It's just not reasonable. It can't happen. And I started to think about what kind of security Odeon has for the phones that they're seizing for the duration of the film. And my guess is none. So I've sent off some questions to their PR firm, and also to the PR firm for Orange, which is the mobile phone company that is the major advertiser at Odeon, to find out what exactly they're doing. Have they bonded and done background checks on the people who have access to those phones? Do they have anti-counterfeiting measures in the claim checks and so on? The more I think about it, the more interesting it gets. So I'm going to write a little column about this for the Guardian. I can't wait to hear what they come back with and tell me about. The other cool news: the press previews have started for the play of Little Brother that's on in Chicago, and I've just finalized plans to actually go through Chicago on the way to the Campbell Award ceremony in Kansas. Little Brother is up for the Campbell Award as well, which is a juried literary award given out at the university in Kansas, just outside Kansas City. And so I think around July 8th, I'm probably going to get to Chicago. Anyway, the first reviews are in on the press preview, and it sounds like they're doing a really good job with it. I've read the script, and I'm pretty happy with it. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to say was a little completely off the cuff plug for a book that I'm rereading and really enjoying, a book called Ariel by Stephen Boyett, which is a kind of post-apocalyptic novel about a world in which technology stops working and magic starts. And I read this book for the first time when I was really young, maybe about 12, and I probably read it 20 times since. And the thing that prompted me to get it off the shelf is there's a sequel coming 25 years later. And Stephen Boyett's editor sent me a copy, and I pulled my old paperback of the original, which is going to be reissued shortly, off the shelf, and I've been rereading it, and boy, is it a good book. So if you're looking for a great, cracking adventure story, you can get used copies of Ariel, Ariel, by Boyett, Boyett, pretty cheaply on Amazon. But of course, in a couple of months, there'll be the new edition, and then a couple of months after that, there'll be the sequel. Anyway, that's enough administrivia. Now on to the reading from Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, my 2005 Tor Books novel. Mimi found a spare blanket in the closet, reeking of mothballs and scarred with a few curdled cigarette burns, and she spread it out on the floor and helped him lift Grant's body onto it and wind it tightly around him. "What now?" she said. He looked down at the wound sheet, the lump within it. He sat down heavily on the bed. His chest was tight, and his breath came in short hups. She sat beside him and put an arm around his shoulder, tried to pull his head down to her bosom, but he stiffened his neck. "I knew this was coming," he said. "When we killed Darren, I knew." She stood and lit a cigarette. "This is your family business," she said. "Why we're driving up north?" He nodded, not trusting his voice, seeing the outline of Grad's face, outlined in the moth-eaten blanket. "So," she said, "let's go up north then. Take an end." The night was cold, and they staggered under the weight of the body wound in the blanket, laid him out in the trunk of the car, shifting luggage and picnic supplies to the back seat. At 2 a.m. the motel lights were out, and the road was dark and silent but for the soughing of the wind and the distant sounds of night animals. "Are you okay to drive?" she said, as she piled their clothes indiscriminately into the suitcases. "What?" he said. The cool air on his face was waking him up a little, but he was still in a dream universe. The air was spicy, and outdoors it reminded him powerfully of home and those simpler times. He looked at Mimi without really seeing her. "Are you okay to drive?" The keys were in his hands, the car smelling of the detailing in a can mist that the rental agency sprayed on the upholstery to get rid of the discount traveler farts between rentals. "I can drive," he said. Home and the mountain and the washing machine and the nook where he'd slept for 18 years and the golems and the cradle they'd hewn for him. Another 10 or 12 hours driving and they'd be at the foot of the trail where the grass grew to waist high. Well then, drive. She got in the car and slammed her door. He climbed in, started the engine, and put the Hertzmobile into reverse. 2 hours later, he realized that he was going to nod off. The thumps of the body sliding in the trunk and the suitcases rattling around in the back seat had lost their power to keep him awake. The body's thumping had hardly had the power to begin with. Once the initial shock had passed, the body became an object only, a thing, a payload he had to deliver. Alan wondered if he was capable of feeling the loss. "You were 11 then," he said. It was suddenly as though no time had passed since they'd sat on the bed and she told him about Auntie. "Yes," she said. It was as though no time had passed. A shiver went up his back. He was wide awake. No time had passed. "Yes, I was living with a nice family in Oakville who were sending me to a nice girls' school where we wore blazers over our tunics, and I had a permanent note excusing me from gym classes. In a building full of 400 girls going through puberty, one more fat, shy girl who wouldn't take off her top was hardly noteworthy. The family, they were nice, waspy. They called me Cheryl with a Y. When I asked them where I'd been before, about Auntie, they looked sad and hurt and worried for me, and I learned to stop. They hugged me and touched my wings, and never said anything, and never wiped their hands on their pants after touching them. They gave me a room with a computer and a CD player and a little TV of my own, and asked me to bring home my friends. I had none. But they found other girls who would come to my birthday parties on May 1, which was exactly 2 months after their son's birthday and 2 months before their daughter's birthday. I can't remember any of their names. But they made me birthday cards, and they made me breakfast and dinner, and they made me welcome. I could watch them grilling burgers in the backyard by the above-ground pool in the summer from my bedroom window. I could watch them building forts or freezing skating rinks in the winter. I could listen to them eating dinner together while I did my homework in the bedroom. There was a place for me at the dinner table, but I couldn't sit there, though I can't remember why. "Wait a second," Alan said. "You don't remember?" She made a sad noise in her throat. I was told I was welcome, but I knew I wasn't. I know that sounds paranoid, crazy. Maybe I was just a teenager. There was a reason, though. I just don't know what it was. I knew then. They knew it, too. No one blamed me. They loved me, I guess." "You stayed with them until you went to school?" "Almost. Their daughter went to Waterloo, then the next year their son went to McGill in Montreal, and then it was just me and them. I had 2 more years of high school, but it just got unbearable. With their children gone, they tried to take an interest in me, tried to make me eat with them, take me out to meet their friends. Every day felt worse, more wrong. One night, I went to a late movie by myself downtown and then got to walking around near the clubs and looking at the club kids and feeling this terrible feeling of loneliness. And when I was finally ready to go home, the last train had already gone. I just spent the night out, wandering around, sitting in a back booth at Sneaky D's and drinking Cokes, watching the sun come up from the top of Christie Pitts overlooking the baseball diamond. I was a 17-year-old girl from the suburbs, wearing a big coat and staring at her shoelaces, but no one bugged me. When I came home the next morning, no one seemed particularly bothered that I'd been away all night. If anything, the parental people might have been a little distraught that I came home. I think I'll get my own place, I said. They agreed, and agreed to put the lease in their name to make things easier. I got a crummy little basement in what the landlord called Cabbagetown, but what was really Regent's Park, and I switched out to a huge anonymous high school to finish school, worked in a restaurant at nights and on weekends to pay the bills. The night highway rushed past them, quiet. She lit a cigarette and rolled down her window, letting in the white noise crash of the wind and the smell of the smoke mixed with the pine and summer reek of the roadside. Give me one of those, Alan said. She lit another and put it between his lips, damp with her saliva. His skin came up in goose pimples. Who knows about your wings, he said. Krishna knows, she said. And you? She looked out into the night. The family in Oakville. If I could remember where they lived, I'd look them up and ask them about it. Can't remember their names or their faces. I remember the pool, though, and the barbecue. Who else knows? There was no one else before Krishna, no one that I remember anyway. I have a brother, he said, and then swallowed hard. I have a brother named Brad. He can see the future. Yeah? Yeah. He pawed around for an ashtray and discovered that it had been removed, along with the lighter, from the rental car's dashboard. Cursing, he pinched off the coal of the cigarette and flicked it out to the roadside, hoping that it would burn out quickly. Then he tossed the butt over his shoulder at the back seat. As he did, the body in the trunk rolled while he navigated a curve in the road, and he braked hard, getting the car stopped in time for him to open the door and pitch a rush of vomit onto the roadway. You okay to drive? Yeah, I am. He sat up and put the car into gear, an inch to the shoulder, then put it in park and set his blinkers. The car smelled of sour food and sharp cigarettes, and God, it smelled of the body in the trunk. It's not easy to be precognizant, Alan said, and pulled back onto the road, signaling even though there were no taillights or headlights as far as the eye could see. I believe it, she said. He stopped telling us things after a while. It just got him into trouble. I'd be studying for an exam, and he'd look at me and shake his head slowly, sadly. Then I'd flunk out, and I'd be convinced that it was him psyching me out. Or he'd get picked for kickball, and he'd say, "What's the point? This team's going to lose," and wander off, and they'd lose, and everyone would hate him. He couldn't tell the difference between what he knew and what everyone else knew. Didn't know the difference between the past and the future sometimes. He stopped telling us, and when we figured out how to read it in his eyes, he stopped looking at us. And then something terrible. Someone I cared about died, and he didn't say anything about it. I could have stopped it, prevented it. I could have saved her life, but he wouldn't talk. He drove. For real? He could see the future? She said softly. Her voice had more emotion than he'd ever heard in it, and she rolled down the window and lit another cigarette, pluming smoke into the roar of the wind. Yeah, Alan said. A future or the future. I never figured it out. A little of both, I suppose. You stopped talking, huh? Yeah, Alan said. I know what that's like, Mimi said. I hadn't spoken more than 3 words in the 6 months before I met Krishna. I worked at a direct mail house, proofreading the mailing labels. No one wanted to say anything to me, and I just wanted to disappear. It was soothing, in a way, reading all those names. I dropped out of school after Christmas break, just didn't bother going back again, and never paid my tuition. I threw away my houseplants and flushed my fish down the toilet so there wouldn't be any living thing that depended on me. She worked her hand between his thigh and the seat. Krishna sat next to me on the subway. I was leaning forward because my wings were long, the longest they've ever been, and wearing a big parka over them. He leaned forward to match me and tapped me on the shoulder. I turned to look at him, and he said, "I get off at the next stop. Will you get off with me and have a cup of coffee? I've been riding next to you on the subway for a month, and I want to find out what you're like." I wouldn't have done it except before I knew what I was doing, I'd already said, "I beg your pardon," because I wasn't sure I'd heard him right, and once I said that, once I'd spoken, I couldn't bear the thought of not speaking again. They blew through Kappa's casing at 10 a.m. on a gray morning that dawned with drizzle and bad-tempered clouds overhead. The little main drag, which Alan remembered as a bustling center of commerce when he'd waited out half a day to change buses, was deserted, the only evidence of habitation the occasional car pulling through a donut store drive-through lane. Jesus, who divorced me this time? Mimi said, ungumming her eyes and stuffing a fresh cigarette in her mouth. Fear and Loathing again, right? It's the road trip novel, she said. What about On the Road? Oh, that, she said. Kerouac was a Martian on crank. Dope fiend prose isn't fit for human consumption. Thompson isn't a dope fiend. No, that was just a put-on. He wrote about drugs, not on drugs. Have you read Kerouac? I couldn't get into it, she said. He pulled sharply off the road and into a parking lot. What's this, she said. The library, he said. Come on. It smelled just as it had when he was 17, standing among the aisles of the biggest collection of books he'd ever seen. Sweet, dusty. Here, he said, crossing to the fiction section. The fiction section at the library in town had fit into 3 spinner racks. Here it occupied its own little corner of overstuffed bookcases. Here, he said, running his finger down the plastic Bredart wraps on the spines of the books, the faded Dewey labels. H-I-J-K. There it was, the edition he'd remembered from all those years ago. On the Road. Come on, he said. We've got it. You can't check that out, she said. He pulled out his wallet as they drew closer to the checkout counter. He slid out the plastic ID holder, flipping past the health card and the driver's license, not a very good license of his face or his name on either, and then produced a library card so tattered that it looked like a pirate's map on parchment. He slid it delicately out of the plastic sleeve, unbending a frayed corner, smoothing the felt-like surface of the card, the furry type. He slid the card and the book across the counter, Mimi and the librarian, a boy of possibly Mimi's age, who wore a mesh-back cap just like his patron's, but at a certain angle that suggested urbane irony, goggled at it, as though Alan had just slapped down a museum piece. The boy picked it up with such roughness that Alan flinched on behalf of his card. This isn't, the boy began. It's a library card, Alan said. They used to let me use it here. The boy set it down on the counter again. Mimi peered at it. There's no name on that card, she said. Never needed one, he said. He'd gotten the card from the sour-faced librarian back home, tricked her out of it by dragging along Bradley and encouraging him to waddle off into the shelves and start pulling down books. She'd rolled it into her typewriter, and then they'd both gone chasing after Brad, and then she'd asked him again for his name, and they'd gone chasing after Brad, then for his address, then Brad again. Eventually, he was able to simply snitch it out of the platen of the humming Selectric and walk out. No one ever looked closely at it again. Not even the thoroughly professional staffers at the Kappa's casing branch, who'd let him take out a stack of books to read in the bus station overnight, while he waited for the morning bus to Toronto. He picked up the card again and then set it down. It was the first piece of identification he'd ever owned, and in some ways the most important. I have to give you a new card, the meshback kid said, with a barcode. We don't take that card anymore. He picked it up and made to tear it in half. No! Alan roared and lunged over the counter to seize the kid's wrists. The kid startled back and reflexively tore at the card, but Alan's iron grip on his wrists kept him from completing the motion. The kid dropped the card, and it fluttered to the carpet behind the counter. Give it to me, Alan said. The boy's eyes, wide with shock, began to screw shut with pain. Alan let go his wrists, and the kid chafed them back, backing away another step. His shout had drawn older librarians from receiving areas and offices behind the counter, women with the look of persons accustomed to terminating children's mischief and ejecting rowdy drunks with equal aplomb. One of them was talking into a phone, and 2 more were moving cautiously towards them, sizing them up. We should go, Mimi said. I need my library card, he said, and was surprised as anyone at the pout in his voice, a sound that was about 6 years old, stubborn, and wounded. Mimi looked hard at him, then at the librarians converging on them, then at the meshback kid, who had backed all the way up to a work surface several paces back of them. She planted her palms on the counter and swung one foot up onto it, vaulting herself over. Alan saw the back of her man's jacket bulge out behind her as her wings tried to spread when she took to the air. She snatched up the card, then planted her hands again and leapt into the air. The toe of her trailing foot caught the edge of the counter and she began to tumble, headed for a faceplant in the grayed-out industrial carpet. Alan had the presence of mind to catch her tit crashing into his head, and gentle her to the floor. "We're going," Mimi said. "Now." Alan hardly knew where he was anymore. The card was in Mimi's hand, though, and he reached for it, making a keening noise deep in his throat. "Here," she said, handing it to him. When he touched the felted cardstock, he snapped back to himself. "Sorry," he said lamely to the mashback kid. Mimi yanked his arm, and they jumped into the car, and he fumbled the key into the ignition, fumbled the car to life. His head felt like a balloon on the end of a taut string, floating some yards above his body. He gunned the engine, and the body rolled in the trunk. He'd forgotten about it for a while in the library, and now he remembered it again. Maybe he felt something then, a twitchy twinge of grief, but he swallowed it hard, and it went away. The clunk-clunk of the wheels going over the curb as he missed the curb cut, back out onto the road. Mimi sucking breath in a hiss as he narrowly avoided getting T-boned by a rusted-out pickup truck, and then the hum of the road under his wheels. "Alan," Mimi said. "It was my first piece of identification," he said. "It made me a person who could get books out of the library." They drove on, headed for the city limits at a few clicks over the speed limit. Fast, lots of green lights. "What did I just say?" Alan said. "You said it was your first piece of ID," Mimi said. She was twitching worriedly in the passenger seat. Alan realized she was air driving, steering and braking an invisible set of controls as he veered around the traffic. "You said it made you a person." "That's right," Alan said. "It did." "Okay then. Talk to you next Monday."